As tensions between the US and China are at an all-time high, a war between the world's two biggest economies doesn't seem all that unlikely anymore. Many global supply lines are reliant on China, and especially business models like dropshipping fully rely on importing cheap goods from Asia's biggest economy. But all that would be threatened if China is involved in a major war. So as business owners that rely on China, we have to ask ourselves, what's going to happen to us and many other businesses around the world if a war breaks out? What are our options and how can we avoid losing it all? To understand that, we first have to understand why the US and China might be facing off in a war soon. And no, a spy balloon is not the cause. Most likely, this would start with Taiwan, a small but important island nation that China considers its own. However, Taiwan considers itself independent and their governmental structures couldn't be any more different from China's. While the Chinese government speak of quote reunification by force if necessary, polls from late 2022 show that less than 7% of the Taiwanese population supports unification with China. Over the years, Taiwan has built up its military with the help of allies such as the United States, making a Chinese invasion of Taiwan not an easy task. I will not go into the history of how Taiwan became independent as that's not today's topic. As it stands today, Taiwan is important to the rest of the world because they manufacture the majority of advanced semiconductors, aka the chips that power pretty much all our modern tech. This is why the US and allies like Japan have claimed they are ready to defend Taiwan, as among other reasons, letting the majority of the world's advanced semiconductors fall to China would be a disaster. So now we have the reasons, let's get into what would happen. It's hard to tell how exactly the war would play out and who would come out on top. All we can say is, such an amphibious invasion is not easy, and it would certainly not be over quickly, even if China manages to land large amounts of troops and vehicles on Taiwan. The economic impact would be felt from day one, however. We can expect the US and its allies placing sanctions on China, and China placing sanctions on the US and its allies, making trade very hard or impossible depending on the goods. The two biggest economies, that by the way make up over 1/3 of the world's total economic output going to war, that alone would send huge shockwaves around the world and likely cause a global financial crash many times worse than when the war in Ukraine started. As most of the world relies on goods or services from China or the US in one way or the other, supply chain issues would arise, many times worse than during COVID. And obviously, if you have a business, such as a dropshipping store, it would become impossible to import products from China and sell them in the US or other Western countries. So at least temporarily, you would have to close down. However, money rules the world, and if money is on the table, people will find solutions, and that's where countries such as India and Vietnam come in. As a lot of manufacturing closes down in China, there are gaps to fill, and who better to do that than a country with a large population and cheap labor? With China being at war, many Chinese business owners will want to look elsewhere to continue selling to customers in the West, and they are likely to set up shop in countries that are close but are not under sanctions, and they will bring their money and their knowledge to these countries. So eventually, there will most likely be a structure in place that allows businesses like dropshipping to function again, but how long that would take is hard to say. So, all of this paints a pretty bleak picture, and many people would lose everything they have built. But what can we do to avoid losing it all? First, an amphibious invasion like that doesn't happen from one day to the other. It requires a lot of military buildup along the Chinese coast, mainly in Fujian province, and that would obviously not go unnoticed, just like the Russian buildup along the Ukrainian border didn't go unnoticed, and signs for an impending invasion were there as far back as November 2021, 3 months before they actually invaded. If we take a look at the Taiwan Strait, we see that it's about 130 kilometers wide, or about 80 miles in freedom units. That's almost the distance from Florida to Cuba. So if we see such a military buildup happening close to the Taiwan Strait, it's better to start preparing for the worst in terms of your business. There are already suppliers in countries like India that offer a lot of similar products. However, the infrastructure for a business like dropshipping is still far better in China, but with an upcoming invasion, it might be time to start looking elsewhere and making sacrifices in order to soften the blow to your business. If you already have the contacts and the system in place to make it work, you will have a head start and a significant advantage, as most of your competition will be wiped out in the case of a major war between the US and China. So what can we take away from this? Hope for the best, but prepare for the worst, and closely follow the events around Taiwan so you can see it coming and avoid the worst. This is it for today's video. Please leave your opinions down below and let me know if you agree with me. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.